just a quiet bank holiday weekend, completely exploded by that letter. Did you see that coming, and have you read anything like it in your career?
Hi, Richard. Well, actually, it's a blessing for us because this is the height of the silly season. Pretty precious few stories around, and this has come like a new lease of life for us in the newspaper world, and particularly political world. I think this letter will go down as like a taste of honey to the Boris supporters, all those who are fervent Brexiteers, and die in a ditch allies of the former Prime Minister, as indeed Nadine Dorries is. Others, I think, will see it in a different light, and these are the two contrasting sides of the modern Conservative Party. I think there will be people who will regard this as a betrayal, not just of the serving Prime Minister, who is, after all, a Conservative MP and a Brexiteer, but also of the people who are still struggling to hold on to their seats in the next general election, those Tory MPs that will feel that that this has damaged their chances quite a lot. And also, quite a few of her constituents will feel that this long, drawn-out resignation saga should have been brought to a close much sooner, indeed at the moment that she announced that she planned to go.
That's right. I mean, many will see it as, whilst they might agree with some of the comments in it, they will say, well, it's rather petulant. Or perhaps it's petulant, relevant at the same time, do you think?
Well, it is. I mean, there's no doubt that there's an awful lot of personal bile in this and personal references to Rishi and his smile and his Savile Row suits and so on. These are not the sort of cool, calm, collected thoughts of someone who is talking about politics. This is deeply and bitterly personal. And some of it has to be, I'm sure, and people will certainly believe it is, because of the fact that she was denied the peerage that she was promised by Boris Johnson, for whom she is, of course, probably the most outspoken supporter up until recently, up until now, as a Member of Parliament.
That's right. And I mean, some of the criticisms that she has of the Prime Minister, the fact that he has no democratic mandate, and the fact that so many of his policies don't actually seem conservative. I mean, many would agree with those. Do you think he will in any way listen, or is he just set on his path whether or not he does a cabinet reshuffle?
I think one of the most telling points that Nadine has made in this letter is the fact that very little seems to have been done that resonate with voters generally as a result of Rishi's advent as Prime Minister. We've seen taxes rise rather than reduce. We've seen inflation rise and then lower, but not because of anything that the government has done. We've seen no real boldness on the immigration front, or at least if there is any boldness, the fruits of that boldness have not yet been seen, and really don't look like they're going to be seen this side of a general election. I think that the only thing that Rishi really can do, and they've played this down quite a lot in the Treasury and in Downing Street, is to use the upcoming autumn statement, or effectively another budget, to do something significant on the tax front. And I suspect that's what they will do. What they need to do is to choose one real bombshell tax reduction, whatever it is, whether it's VAT or stamp duty or the inheritance tax. Somewhere along the line, they've got to really show that they've made a difference to an awful lot of people's lives. That's not easy, but it'll cost a lot of money too.
That's right. And to listeners and viewers, if you haven't seen this letter, do get hold of a copy of it, because it's long, it's very detailed. The list of criticisms that what Sunak has or has not done is extraordinary. Levelling up being discarded, social care abandoned, the online safety bill watered down, BBC funding reform, the clock run down, Mental Health Act timed out, defence spending reduced, commitment to net zero animal welfare squandered, increased corporation tax to the highest levels, bonfire of EU legislation swerved, the Windsor framework a dead duck. I mean, the list goes on and on. But overall, Trevor, I mean, in your career, where does this sit amongst the most dynamite type resignation letters?
Well, I think one of the problems with this letter is that it's very much too long, covers too much ground, and is far too bitter. And it makes accusations that I think don't actually stand up. It makes Nadine look a bit like a conspiracy theorist, which is not a good look in the circumstances. And it also, I think, fails to acknowledge that the Prime Minister, who she so fervently endorses and supports, was not exactly a roaring success in terms of being Prime Minister. Winning elections, yes. Getting Brexit done, yes. And in some aspects, dealing with the pandemic. But in many other ways, Boris Johnson was the architect of his own downfall. And I think we're paying a price for that downfall in terms of some of the spending that took place under his premiership. Okay, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, but it was Boris Johnson who pressed for the spend policies, which we're paying for now with a very significant national debt.
That's right. Well, I do urge you, listeners and viewers, try and get hold of a copy of it. It is quite remarkable. A very, very long, very personal attack on the Prime Minister. I share with you, Trevor, some of those observations that, in a sense, she may have overstepped the mark to try and really get the message home. And, of course, she is trying to sell a book which is coming out, I think, around about the time of the party conference season. And sometimes it looks a little bit as though that's being over-promoted. Trevor, whilst I've got you, I just want to move on to another story within the papers yesterday in the Times about the quantity of money and fundraising and expenditure within the main parties. And it is quite remarkable that last year the Labour Party significantly out-fundraised the Conservatives. Labour raised £47 million in 2022, the Tories 31 million. And similar sort of spending levels as well. I mean, this is a huge, huge turnaround, isn't it, from what you would normally expect in terms of money raising and spending?
Yes, and I think it signifies an attitude which has now begun to set in, which is that the Labour Party is going to form the next government, one way or another, whether as an outright majority or as a minority government. And that the Tories are basically finished. That's the mood. It's a bit like the bookies. The bookies will put money into something that they think is going to be a winner. And this is what the business community is doing. And today's interview with Rachel Reeves about the Labour Party's plans on taxation, which is basically a repudiation of everything they stood for only 12 months ago. So believe it if you like. But what they're saying is what they're doing is uttering reassuring noises to the business community and to the middle class potential Tory voting community that their money is safe in their own hands. I mean, as I say, believe it if you like. Wait for another couple of years of Labour rule to find out if it's true. But that's quite effective. It mollifies a lot of voters, a lot of people in the city who otherwise would be absolutely convinced that the Labour government, would raid their revenues and milk them for wealth tax.
I mean, these numbers are absolutely huge. To put it in context, those are the two main parties, Labour raising 47 million, the Tories raising 31 last year. The first 6 months of this year, Tories raised 17 million, Labour I think, have raised about 13 million. You compare that to the smaller parties, the Lib Dems, I think, are around 5 or 6 million. A much smaller party like the one that I lead, Reform, would be just under 1 million. I mean, the difference is absolutely huge, isn't it, in the way that our political system works?
Yes, and I think that you'll see that gap between Labour and the Conservatives narrowing in terms of cash backing. There will be sponsors coming forward to back the Conservatives no matter what. So this is a big money election coming up. It's beginning to rival what's happening in the United States, where the amount of money basically buys the election in the end. It hasn't quite reached that, but we are seeing an awful lot of cash being stored up to give one side or the other the winning margin.
And as part of that, Trevor, it turns out that the Electoral Commission is planning to increase the spending limits at the next election, which will then become the most expensive election ever, is the headline. They're increasing the spending limits by some 80% to take account, I think, of inflation and a few other factors. But again, that is going to massively favour the two main parties, and because there's actually a limit on how much parties can spend at headquarter level and how much they can spend at the constituency level. And these numbers haven't changed since 2000. So again, if Labour keep fundraising, then people are just going to be utterly swamped with leaflets, advertising, and so on.
Yes, and not utterly swamped with the politicians who they'd like to see face-to-face and hear from directly. It'll all be through a filter, through an advertising filter, through a public relations filter, and we will see an homogenized, sort of sanitized version of those political leaders in a way that even only 10 years ago or 20 years ago, when Tony Blair, for instance, was fighting the elections he won, he was actually out there on the stump taking difficult questions face-to-face with voters, with the media. All of that's been systematically watered down during, in fact, the Labour years, but since then by the Conservatives as well. So this is a manufactured process. This is a sort of sausage-making machine. It is not real politics. It's not real democracy. It's all done through almost artificial intelligence, sensing out what people might be vulnerable to and what they will not want. For instance, you've seen the suggestion that calling Keir Starmer Sir Keir Starmer backfires among working class voters. This is the nitty-gritty, the fine-tuning of what sells in politics and what doesn't these days.
But do you think, I mean, in what could become almost a year-long election campaign with lots of money spent, as we've just touched on, do you think Keir Starmer actually will face ordinary people and take questions in the way that Tony Blair did? Or actually, do you think he just hasn't got the courage to do so? Or perhaps he doesn't need to. Perhaps he just needs to keep talking in gentle riddles.
I think your last point is the key to it. Why risk facing the voters more than you have to when you're ahead by 20 points? So I think that will be his way of going forward, unless, of course, he hits some sort of problem or crisis. Then he will have to confront those voters and speak directly to them. And the other point about Keir Starmer is that he's not very good at confronting voters and dealing with people face to face. It's he's a clunky performer generally, and as a politician, really lacks any of the deft footwork of people like Tony Blair, David Cameron, and Rishi Sunak.
It does seem to me the final point, the big issue which is facing the country, and I think infuriating millions of people of whatever party one supports, the issue of the boats. Neither of the main two parties have got a solution, and if the numbers keep coming in the way that they are at the moment, by 12 or 14 months' time, who knows, Trevor, where this will be? We could face a sort of stop the boats election like we had in Australia 10 years ago.
Frankly, I think, Richard, we do know where we're going to be, which is no further forward than we are today. Unless something is in the pipeline that you and I simply don't know about, and a steely nerve which is not evident so far, neither side seems to be prepared to take any of the sort of drastic action that would be necessary, or indeed the risks in relationships with our European partners, particularly France. If they were to do something, for instance, like sending the boats back in the mid-channel and redirecting them, taking them back into French waters, that would cause an enormous fuss with the French, and it would put at risk our relationships for a while. But I think, frankly, if you're going to seriously stop the small boats, I can't see any other way of doing it.
I agree with you, Trevor. That is my policy. I think you're entitled to do it under existing international law. I've read the treaties, but it requires courage, it requires guts and a willingness, as you say, to accept a bit of grief from the international community. But here's the thing. If you did that, Trevor, then actually you can show what should be done in the Mediterranean, where sadly many, many hundreds of migrants are dying every month, every year.
Yes, and I think that if we did do that, it would stop the traffic almost overnight. I think it would be extremely popular with the majority of voters in this country. and it could transform the way the next general election is going to be fought or won.
Fascinating. Trevor,
I simply don't see it happening.
I agree with you. I can't see it at the moment, but who knows? Trevor Kavanagh, political columnist at The Sun, thank you very much for your thoughts there on that explosive Nadine Dorries letter, and also on the party spending and the increase in that. Whatever you think about politics, folks, you are going to be seeing adverts and leaflets and everything. Huge spending to the type of level you've never seen before.